dia a todas e todos. Eu me chamo Tomoo Marukawa, sou professor de Universidade de Tokio. So that's all I can speak in Portuguese. I will speak in English in the following. So today I would like to talk about the China's economic growth and its impact on the world economy. And I think it's pretty relevant to Brazil. I stayed several days in São Paulo and talked to the people there about the impact of China, and I think it was pretty big. So I will start from talking about the current US-China trade war, which I think all of the world is paying attention to. Then So let me start from talking about the US-China trade war. Will America crush China? So starting from this year, March 2018, the Trump administration has started to attack China in several ways. Like the first one was Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. In fact, it is Trade Shrinking Act. It has imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on aluminum. Of course, the target was not only China, but all countries, even including Japan. But the villain in this story, overproduction of steel, was targeted at China. And then Trump declared that the U.S. will use Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. This act was used against Japan several times during the 1980s and 90s, and so we are quite familiar with this term, but we didn't expect that it will be used today. I mean, after the establishment of the WTO, we thought that it's always already out of date, but apparently Trump didn't think in that way. So he said that the U.S. will impose tariffs on $50 billion worth of imports from China as a retaliation against China's infringement of U.S. intellectual property rights. And then another big attack was on a specific company, ZTE. ZTE is a famous smartphone manufacturer. It's quite similar with Huawei, a high-tech company, and the U.S. said that this company had violated U.S. law, so the American companies should not transact with this company, which put this company to a very difficult situation. It was almost pushed at the verge of bankruptcy, because without U.S. chips, they cannot make smartphones. However, in May, it seemed like the U.S. and China has reached on a terms and to avoid trade war. However, that wasn't the case. On July 6th, U.S. did start to impose tariffs on China on $34 billion worth of imports, and then in August and September, the U.S. has expanded to its duties on altogether $250 billion worth of imports from China. So that's a great amount. That's a very big amount. It covered almost half of China's exports to the United States. So the trade war that has expanded to this side is unprecedented, I think. And perhaps this marks a historical change, because the United States, after the Second World War, has been the creator of the liberal free trade regime supported by GATT, WTO, and IMF. Until 1970, the U.S. had enough money. They exported a lot, so they gathered money and then returned it back to other countries in the form of foreign direct investment, lending, aid, and so on. This situation has changed in the 1970s. The U.S. has started to run trade deficits. So the U.S. had to borrow money from other countries like Japan, China, but still the liberal world trade regime continued. And China, on the other hand, was a latecomer, very latecomer. It has been a socialist country, or even it is still a socialist country. So its domestic economy was closed. It had very high tariffs, once its tariff on cars was like 100%. And so China was a latecomer. Finally, it joined the WTO in 2001, and at this time, China reluctantly lowered its tariff to around 15% on average, and currently it's around 10%. And in October, China announced to reduce it to 7.5%, which is still not as low as the developed countries like the US and Japan, but China has made efforts to open up its market. And so China has been catching up with other developed countries in the liberal regime, while the US suddenly changed its course to protectionism. So this may mark a turning point, historical turning point. And this trade war reminds us of very bad scenarios. A U.S. Political scientist named Graham Allison, Harvard University, he wrote a book last year talking about the coming war between the U.S. and China, and that the reason he is talking about that because when there's a hegemon, a very powerful country, and if the number two, the second largest economy, approaches the biggest economy, then lots of trouble happens. And he called that the Thucydides trap. Thucydides is a historian in ancient Greek. He wrote about the history of Athens and Sparta. Sparta was the hegemon in ancient Greece. Athens was a rising power, and Sparta was threatened by the rise of Athens. So they ended up into a very long war, which destroyed both of them. So this interesting graph shows the relative size of the biggest economy in the world, which is the United States. So it's 100%, and the second largest. So the United States has become the biggest economy in the world in 1870 something, and taking over the United Kingdom. So this is United Kingdom, Germany. The gap between U.S. and the other two has been widening. And here comes Japan. Japan was a rising power in the 1960s, 70s, and in 1995, Japan has reached to 70% of the United States GDP. So at that time, I remember the U.S.-Japan trade friction was very severe. We read stories about U.S. attacking this and that almost every day or every week. However, we did not call that trade war. It was not as severe as the current trade war between China and the United States, but still, it was quite big trouble for Japan. We have been annoyed by the U.S. attack, but happily enough, sadly, our GDP did not reach the United States. It has started to decline. So we haven't heard so much of trade friction since then, because no longer Japan was not a threat for Japan was no longer a threat for the United States. And here comes China. China was a very small economic power until 2000, and suddenly it started to rise, and currently it is 63% of the United States. So I think this explains a lot why the U.S. suddenly became worried about China, anxious about China's rise, and want to attack China. And comparing Japan and China, Japan's population is only one-tenth of the United States. So perhaps Japan can never reach the size of the United States, because our population is still only 1.2 billion. So we restart from this table. I think it would be too small, so you can share this, or I can share this slides with you. I was talking that Japan's GDP could be bloated because of the appreciation of yen, while China's rise is real because first it has a very big population of 1.4 billion, 10 times more than Japan, 4 times more than the United States. So I think it's quite natural that China will catch up with the U.S. when the people are willing to become richer, and they're trying hard to become richer. Then I think it's natural. Currently, the Chinese GDP is only 63% of the United States, but according to the calculation made by World Bank, IMF, the actual size of GDP of China has already surpassed that of the United States. That is calculated using the purchasing power parity. Currently, China's GDP per capita is $8,800, which is catching up with Brazil, I found. And the most important part of China's rise is that it has a very great amount of trade. China's trade volume has already exceeded that of the United States. Especially its export is by far the largest in the world. So looking around 195 economies, countries, regions around the world, 136 economies had more trade with China than with the United States, while 59 others had more trade with the United States than with China. So for more than half of the world, China is a greater trade partner than the United States. I think this is a very important point. So, we in Japan, we thought that we are a great country. We are the member of the G7 group of 7. We have been proud of being a member of the G7, USA, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan. And we thought that the G7 can determine the direction of world economy. It was true in 1990 because the G7 added together had 2/3 of the global GDP. So this strange map shows the relative size of each country's GDP. So Japan was big, Western Europe was big, US was big, and Canada was big, and China was small. But we are heading towards a world that looks like this. China is much bigger, Japan is much smaller, and India will be bigger. Of course, I believe Brazil will be bigger. So in this period, we cannot say that the G7 can determine the world because it has only 1/3 of the world's GDP. So definitely we need to incorporate other big economies to make decisions. And so I think we definitely need to change our minds on China today. So among East Asian economists, like most economists in Japan, in Korea, we think that China is the factory of the world. It's a major production base of multinational enterprises. China is a low-cost manufacturing base in the global value chain. And Japan and Korea export machinery and core components to China, and China assembles things like these and these smartphones and export them to the United States. So that is the kind of view that economists in Japan and Korea are trying to teach in classes. And I think of course it's correct, but this represents only one side of the Chinese economy. And I think we need to pay attention to another aspect. What is the another aspect? Well, China's trade with countries other than the G7, which I call the emerging economies. Emerging economies is what I define them as Asia, excluding Japan and Hong Kong, Africa, Latin America, of course, including Brazil, East Europe, Russia, Central Asia, Middle East, Oceania. These I define as emerging economies. China's trade with these countries is increasing, both in its exports now. It exports more to the emerging economies than to the G7. 42% to the emerging economies, only 40% to G7. And China imports more from these countries. So I think that is a very important aspect. And then I will talk about China as a capital exporter. China has been a borrowing country in international finance. Until 1993, China had trade deficits. So it had to borrow money from rich countries. And the most important source of money came in the form of foreign direct investment. So that was the period until 1993. From 1994 until 2011, China has run trade surpluses. So China gained more by exporting than paying its imports. And on the other hand, China had kept on receiving lots of foreign direct investment. So money came from both sides, from trade, from investment. So China amassed a lot of foreign currency. So China's state coffins became the richest in the world, with this foreign reserves once reached $3 trillion, which is unprecedented, huge amount of foreign cash in the state coffins. But this situation had ended. China advanced to a new situation, which I call the advanced industrialized country stage, because China still enjoys huge trade surpluses. But now China is spending more abroad. Like you see, lots of Chinese tourists are traveling around the world spending money. And on the other hand, Chinese companies are investing abroad. Like I heard many investments here in Brazil. And also there are quite a few cases of speculation, money going out and in. So China has become a major capital exporter. It is investing, spending, other than imports, spending, exporting capital. So I think both in trade and capital investments, China has become a global power, I think, very big power. However, we don't feel that China is comparable to the United States. One of the biggest reasons is that the Chinese currency is so small. I mean, China's currency is not usable outside China. So the Chinese renminbi is not used in so much in international transactions. Its status is very low. Our Japanese yen is much higher. So that is one aspect, but we cannot underestimate China. And then I will talk briefly about the Belt and Road initiatives. I think it's a good time for China to think about other countries because it's so large in trade volume. It is a great trade partner for other countries. So I think it is natural for China to not only pursue its only interest, but think about others, its partners. And especially the United States is not thinking about other countries. Its president says that America first. If China says China first, I think the world will be a disaster. So I think it is a good initiative for China to think about other countries, and this Belt and Road initiative should be welcomed. And at the beginning, I think the official translation of this Belt and Road initiative was One Belt, One Road. And at that time, it had a Sinocentric meaning because the initial idea was to connect China with Western Europe through the Central Asia and also through the sea. So they proposed one belt and one road. And the Chinese government mobilized state-owned banks, state-owned enterprises to help build bridges, power stations, ports along the world. And also China has established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which seemed to be a driver of this Belt and Road initiative. But judging from China's relationship with the other parts of the world, I found that China has a very deep relationship with not only China's imports mainly does not come from China's exports are not heading towards Western Europe. In fact, the meaning of this map is that the darker places has higher shares of imports from China. So you see, for example, Ethiopia imports more than 30% of its imports from China. So it's natural that the countries around China are darker, but also you can see that many countries in Africa, or even this is Paraguay, many countries here, there have quite deep trade relations with China. And this one shows the share of exports to China among total exports. And also we see that some countries in Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand, and Brazil, Peru, Chile, these have quite a lot of exports to China, while Western Europe is lighter. So I think it does not really make sense to have a better connection with Western Europe because the trade is not so relationship is not so deep. Perhaps it makes more sense to connect these countries, have a better connection with these countries with China. So I think One Belt and One Road has gradually changed its meaning to incorporate other parts of the world, including Latin America, including Africa. And it's a general initiative to build infrastructure in all parts of the world, especially in developing countries. Some doubts, the problem of One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiative is that we don't really understand what is China's real intentions. People like Vice President Pence of the United States criticize that this is a trap. This is a trap. This is a debt trap. China smiles, lends you money, but the interest is very high, and you will end up impossible to pay back, and you need to hand over your territory to China, and so on and so forth. I think I don't really buy this, subscribe to this doubt, but I think at least I can say that China should improve the transparency of its intentions. And also China should consider about improving the terms of loans. I mean, have lower interest rates or loan aid or so on. Okay. Then I will move on to perhaps the main part of my talk, the expansion of China's trade and its impact on emerging economies. One very prominent case is iron and steel industries. China's iron and steel industry is huge. It has literally hundreds of iron and steel manufacturers, both state-owned and private. And the private ones are really, really active. So added together, China produces 800 million tons of steel every year, which is roughly half of the world production. So in order to produce this amount, China need to import a lot of iron ores, mainly from Australia and Brazil. Because of the surge of China's iron industry, the iron ore price has surged from 2005 to 2011. But after 2012, China's iron and steel industry started to decelerate its pace. Now it's quite stable for 5 years. And then this led to the sudden drop of iron ore prices. And iron ore exporters like Australia, Brazil, and other countries had a quite tough time, I think, coping with this fluctuation. And Australia, Brazil are relatively better because they are big economies. But small economy like Sierra Leone in Africa, they suffered a minus 20% GDP growth because the only thing they export is iron ores. The only destination is China. So that created a big problem for this country. And I was curious that perhaps many countries around the world is like Sierra Leone. So they depend on exporting a specific item to China, and they depend heavily. And this is a list of the countries which may be too small for you to read, but countries like Turkmenistan, 83% of their exports go to China, and most of its exports is natural gas. Or like Angola, Congo, they depend heavily on exports to China, and the only thing they export is crude oil. Or like Sierra Leone and so on. And we have lots of such countries around the world, like Zambia, which exports copper, Chile, also copper, and perhaps the only diversified countries that has a tight relationship with China is Japan. Japan exports a variety of things, while the others are concentrating on specific things, like, So such countries will be influenced quite a lot by the fluctuations of China's imports. So I made an econometric analysis here. The conclusion is that 1% growth of exports to China leads to 0.002 to 0.0055% point increase in the GDP growth rate, which sounds like a very small amount, but when a country export growth is like 50% a year, then it's quite a large impact for that country. So if it drops 50%, then it's quite a big impact. And another aspect is China is a very large exporter of manufactured goods. 93% of China's exports are manufactured goods. So countries like South Africa is the most industrialized, most advanced country in Africa, but they suffer from import of Chinese goods. And perhaps South Africa is quite similar to Brazil in South America because it is the most developed, most industrialized, so it exports manufactured goods around the countries around them. But these countries are pressed by China to deindustrialize, I believe. So South Africa is like pushed back to an industrialized country to a primary goods country, exporting country. I think the similar thing applies to countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. So these are industrialized on the one hand, but on the other hand, they have very rich natural resources, agriculture, and so on. So they seem like being pushed back by China. So the situation of being pushed back is shown in this table. It shows that, for example, like Indonesia, in 2000, the share of primary goods in Indonesian export was only 41%, but it increased to 50% because China imports a lot of primary goods from Indonesia. I think I should speed up my talk. Again, I made this econometric analysis that shows that the rise of imports from China leads to the decline of domestic manufacturing in the next year. This reminds me of a Latin American economist named Raul Prebisch. He talked in 1950 about the center and periphery of the world. And at that time, the center was the Western Europe and the United States. And the periphery was the Latin American countries. So what he wrote in that article is quite similar to what is happening today, but the center now is China. China is the industrialized country, and the other countries are pushed back to primary goods exporters. There's another saying in the economic field, it's the curse of natural resources. Virtually, I think they're saying the same thing with Raul Prebisch. Finally, I would briefly want to talk about my views on the future of the world economy. China's per capita GDP currently is slightly before $9,000, and I think the goal for China is to reach the status of a high-income country, which is around $12,000, and it means that China needs to increase 40% of its per capita GDP. I think this is not really a difficult thing, considering the past great records of China. And I think this will happen within around 10 years from now. And however, after that, perhaps China faces lots of troubles. First, its population will reach its peak, so no longer China can rely on its big population. And also the population is aging quite rapidly. And also when we visit China, we see quite amazing infrastructure, like high-speed rail. They already have 10 times longer high-speed rail than Japan. But the problem is that they have already built that much. So what can they expect more? I pretty much doubt. And also, it's a very densely populated country. We cannot imagine that the Chinese consume as much as the Americans. They cannot live in big houses having several cars. So there's a limitation of their investment consumption. So and the U.S. is still growing. Its population is still growing. So that means that China's GDP growth rate will decelerate and the US will keep on growing. So somehow both of them converges. So we may have two big economies. Not China is number one, but two big for the next 50 years. So that's quite perhaps tough situation or a good situation, I'm not sure. But the problem is that the US is inward looking now. Although it is a very strong economic power, but it says that it has trouble in its trade deficit. This table shows that its current account deficit or trade deficit is almost equal to its federal budget deficit. So it's not. It's clear for us Japanese or the Chinese the problem lies in their budget deficit. And the budget deficit comes from their military expenditure. So, very roughly speaking, if the U.S. spend no more on its military, cut its military expenditure to zero, then all of the problem will be solved. They will no longer have trade deficit. But of course, that's impossible. That's impossible. But I think the core of the problem lies here. U.S. spends so much on its military expenditure that makes it inevitable to have a big budget deficit. But its GDP, I mean, the base of collecting tax is shrinking, relatively shrinking. So U.S. bears 36% of all military expenditure in the world, while its GDP is only 22% of the world's total. So this is the crucial core of the problem. We should face this problem. And then how should we solve this problem? Should each country bear military spending in proportion to its GDP? I think that proposal will mean that China should expand its military spending up to the level of the United States. And of course, I would definitely not make such proposal because it's dangerous, quite dangerous. So my solution is that we should let the U.S. shrink its military spending down to its size and no longer arms race around the world. So to make that happen, we should modernize the world system. The world system is still like medieval society. Landlords here and there. So it's pre-modern state. So maybe it sounds too idealistic, I know. But, we can see the modernization of the world system in many aspects, like the WTO, like the IMF, UN Convention on Climate Change, and so on, which is all of them are global governance mechanisms. They have supranational power. So why can't we have similar thing in the military security aspect? I think we do have a possibility. And China's rise should be incorporated into the creation of such global governance mechanism. I think the problem of China is too one-sided, like the BRI. We don't quite understand what it really is its intention. I think the AIIB is a very good proposal because it's an international bank. It's led by China, but it is many other stakeholders. I think we should encourage China to create similar mechanisms. Okay, that's all for my talk. Thank you very much.